Good evening and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. I'm Kat from the Merseyside Skeptics Society and I'll be your host for the evening. If you're joining us for the first time, Skeptics in the Pub Online is a coalition of various Skeptics in the Pub groups from across the UK and Europe. We came together when the COVID pandemic meant that we couldn't have our regular meetings in pubs, so we now host weekly meetings online on a variety of topics that promote science, reason, and critical thinking. For information about future events, please find us on Facebook or Twitter, or check out our website at SitP.online. The format for tonight is we will have our talk from our excellent guest speaker, then we will take a short break followed by a question and answer session. If you'd like to join us for the Q&A, please go to sitp.online/ask to submit your questions or upvote questions you would like to see asked. Our lovely moderators will be dropping that link along with some other useful links into the chat bar throughout the night. We also have closed captions available throughout tonight's event. After the Q&A, we'll be opening up our virtual pub, the Lock-In's Razor, where you're welcome to join us for a chat and a drink of your choice. And tonight we are joined by Lindsey Osterman, who will be talking to us about how the evolutionary psychologist got his hypothesis, and other just so stories, sense and nonsense in evolutionary psychology. So please fill the chat bar with applause and welcome to the screen, Dr. Lindsey Osterman.
Hello, and thank you, Kat. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. It's a true honor to be among skeptics such as yourselves. So as Kat mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about evolutionary psychology, which is an approach to understanding humans that I deeply love. I actually wasn't exposed to evolutionary theory in any depth until fairly late in my education, which is a hazard of growing up in the American South. But once I did start learning about it, I couldn't get enough of it. Not only did it offer up just an entirely new and fascinating way of understanding the natural world, but it offered an indispensable organizing framework for my chosen field of study, which is psychology. So I love this area, but my understanding of it has become much more complex over time. So there were some ideas that I held early in my education that I now realize were somewhat oversimplified. This is a complex area, and some of these ideas take time to wrap your head around. And there were also, or are also, more problems with sort of the public-facing view of evolutionary psychology that I have become more and more aware of over time. And as I've engaged with more people's concerns about the area, I've become aware of just how many folks are unintentionally or intentionally lending sort of a veneer of scientific respectability to some very bad ideas using evolutionary and biological language. So I actually don't think that these concerns usually come out of the academic literature itself, but it's out there and it's real and those concerns are justified. And so what I want to talk about today is the reason that I love this area and what I find so compelling about it. But I also do want to do justice to those criticisms that I've been engaging with since I've started doing podcasting and in the classroom as well, since I teach this. So let's start with what this area is, right? So you can think of evolutionary psychology as sort of the product of two primary areas of scientific inquiry. So the first is the study of ethology, which is a behavior that investigates, or which is a field that investigates animal behavior and has a particular emphasis on behavioral adaptations, which are inherited behaviors that were shaped by natural selection to solve some problem of survival or reproduction. And so pictured on the left here is Konrad Lorenz. You may have heard of him. He was an ethologist who is perhaps most famous for his work on imprinting, which is this inherited behavioral tendency that you see in some species of birds to attach to and follow the first moving object that they see after hatching. And so you can see here that Konrad is being followed around by a gaggle of geese, which is adorable. So ethology research was incredibly important to the emergence of evolutionary psychology because it demonstrated that evolutionary adaptations are not confined to physical traits like eyes and beaks and spider palps, if you will. There are also inherited behavioral and psychological traits that were also designed to solve problems of survival and reproduction. So to take this phenomenon of imprinting again, right? This is an inherited behavioral mechanism that facilitates parental care by keeping offspring close to their caregiver, right? So in some bird species, you see completely different suites of adaptations to keep young in the protection of parents. So in some bird species, the young don't develop the capability of even leaving the nest for a very extended period of time after hatching. And so parents stay close to young by guarding the nest, right? But for other species like these geese, they become ambulatory and can leave the nest very quickly after hatching. And so this imprinting mechanism is a way of keeping them close to their mothers, right? So the second important tradition that gave rise to evolutionary psychology was the cognitive revolution in psychology. So for decades, psychology was dominated by this paradigm of behaviorism, which emphasized the study of only outwardly observable behavior, right? So the work of behaviorists like John Watson and B.F. Skinner taught us a lot about stimulus-response relationships, but they ignored everything that happened in between the stimulus and response, right? So everything in the mind, right, or the black box, as it's been called, right? So they considered this internal processes to be unscientific and irrelevant to a complete understanding of psychology. But in the 1970s, the cognitive revolution in psychological research turned attention back inward, inside the black box. And there was this explosion of research methods that were designed to indirectly observe processes that were previously considered unobservable, right? Like, how much information can we hold in working memory? You can't see that directly, but you can design some very clever experiments in order to infer that indirectly, right? So you saw this explosion of these carefully controlled experiments in psychology to indirectly observe these internal processes, as well as other methods, right? Like self-reports. Just ask people what's going on inside the black box. There are problems with self-reports, but they can also be very useful for some questions, right? And observations of subtle behaviors that have been validated to represent internal states. So the point is that modern psychological research is built around methods that were designed to infer things about how our minds function, how they take in information from the environment and transform it into something useful and actionable for navigating our lives, right? So despite what the behaviorists may have told you, there are in fact lots of scientific ways of studying what's going on inside the black box, right? Evolutionary psychology depends on this assumption, as does psychology in general, right? So in specifics, evolutionary psychology conceptualizes the mind as this integrated network of inherited information processing devices, which we call cognitive modules. Each of these modules takes in a very narrow band of information from the environment and transforms that information to generate some sort of adaptive output, which could be a behavior, or it could be information that feeds into some other module, right? So these cognitive modules are thought to be highly integrated in a way that can produce very complicated cognition and behavior. And so I think that last point is particularly important because I think that it can seem very counterintuitive to think about our experiences, right, which are very flexible and complex, and right, the experience of our mind feels very singular. Like experientially, it doesn't feel to us like our mind is the collection of like very simple input-output devices, right? It feels more coherent, right? But evolutionary psychologists believe that this complexity arises from that integration of those many specific parts. And I don't know enough about AI research to talk about this at length, but I was listening to the Ezra Klein podcast the other day, and they were talking about AI, and it sounds to me as though, leaps forward in artificial intelligence and machine learning have arisen essentially from models that kind of mirror this approach, right? That you can get a lot of complexity and flexibility in learning if you use these very small components that do very simple kinds of decision making and integrate them, right? So this is how evolutionary psychology conceptualizes the mind, right? So to illustrate how this input-output thing works, I'm going to take a relatively example now, and then we're going to get into some more complex examples in a bit. So if you're deciding which of the objects that I have on the slide right now you'd like to eat because you're hungry, and those are the three things in front of you for some reason, evolutionary psychologists would describe your choice in the following way. So each of these objects has features that are cues to its food value. And so you're going to take in these cues about each of the objects that's going to be transformed into this estimation of food value, and then that's going to produce some adaptive output, right? In this case, it'll determine which one you eat, right? So the one on the left looks pretty good. It's unblemished, looks recently picked. You probably have memories of apples that you've eaten in the past, and you know that they are sweet and rewarding and satisfying, and that they don't make you sick, right? So that object has many cues that are being transformed into this judgment of high food value. The object in the middle has a lot of those same features, but it also looks like it has this this rot spot in it, right? So maybe it's been infested by insects or worms, and those cues are associated with contamination. That's going to be a big hit in terms of the food value judgment on that item. And then the rose, as fresh and unblemished and delightful as it looks, right? We probably don't have the same impression of its caloric value, right? Roses are not likely to be sweet. I haven't personally eaten a rose, right? But I'm also not confident that it wouldn't make me sick. And so my judgment of that as an actual high value food item would not be high, right? So ultimately, I'm probably going to eat the nice red shiny apple without worms in it, right? So that's a very simple example just to illustrate how these inputs are transformed into adaptive outputs, right? But again, much of what we do every day is a lot more complex than this. And so in a bit, I'm going to take us through some more complex examples of cognitive mechanisms relating to kin recognition and how we learn about plant safety. But before we get to that, I want to talk about some of the objections that I encounter a lot to evolutionary psychology, because I think these are worth engaging with. So one that I encounter a lot is this idea of human exceptionalism, right? And this can take a number of forms, right? One of them is religious, right? So if you're a religious person and you're trying to reconcile, say, the creation myth in Genesis with the theory of evolution, which you accept, one way that you can do this, and one way that some folks do this, is that they say, well, evolution does account for most of what we see in the natural world, but humans were specially created by God. And so it doesn't apply in quite the same way to us, right? There's nothing in the scientific literature that actually supports this assumption, right? Everything we know suggests that we were given rise to by the same processes that gave rise to anglerfish and capuchin monkeys. So I think we can move on from this version of human exceptionalism. But this also comes up in another form that I do take very seriously. And I'm most likely to encounter this kind of criticism from folks that have expertise in disciplines like sociology, sociocultural anthropology, and history. And they argue sometimes that while evolutionary explanations might be very well suited to explaining things like imprinting and goslings, it can't account for the rich complexity of human psychology because it's subject to these strong cultural and social influences. And I think the issue here is that these disciplines, right, like sociology, sociocultural anthropology, they are devoted to one hugely important class of influences on our psychology and behavior, right? Culture, societal structures, social learning. They also, I think, examine how oppressive systems can be propagated through time in very concrete ways and how that affects human flourishing, right? So I think that this concern stems from the worry that evolutionary psychology might be inappropriately minimizing or even ignoring those influences in favor of explanations that might be overly simple, rigid, biologically deterministic, etc. Right? So I have two things that I want to say about this criticism. One is that I don't actually think that mainstream evolutionary psychology is particularly guilty of this blind spot overall. So culture and social learning are actually highly integrated into evolutionary psychology. But I also don't think that this concern comes from nowhere. Right. So some of the people who have historically shaped the public conversation about evolutionary psychology, right, many of whom, by the way, are outside the discipline, I think do make this mistake. Right. And so to give you an example, right, Jordan Peterson has been criticized for taking some observations, right, say about gender differences and explaining them with these kind of simple, often biological or evolutionary stories to sort of explain them. Right, maybe justify them, some might say, or at the very least justify a kind of fatalism about these kinds of differences, right? Its roots are in biology, so there's nothing we can do about it. We'd be better off leading into those inequalities than trying to fight them, right? So for instance, here are a few fun gender-related observations that have been made. So men are more likely to be represented in CEO positions and other high-status positions than women are, right? It's also the case that women are underrepresented in STEM, right? And sometimes, right, some people, without any acknowledgement of the complex histories surrounding gender that are clearly, I think, causally relevant to those observations, some folks will tell a very simplistic, single cause, often biologically determined story to account for them. So for instance, some people have claimed that the reason that very few women are CEOs boils down to differences in status-seeking motivations, right? And that is based on some literature from evolutionary psychology. Some people have claimed that the reason that women are underrepresented in STEM is because of a sex-differentiated spatial reasoning ability, right? So men have been shown to have an advantage on certain spatial reasoning tasks, right? And there's some hypotheses about why this might be, right, from an evolutionary perspective. So I liked this book cover, Why Men Don't Listen and Why Women Can't Read Maps. This is referencing some of this literature and some of these claims, right? So if these were the kind of simple, essentialist, biologically determined claims and stories actually dominated the area of evolutionary psychology, I probably wouldn't be here today to tell you about how much I like it. But I don't think it is. And I think that the people that are propagating those kinds of claims are wrong in several ways about evolutionary explanations that evolutionary psychologists are particularly well positioned to point out, right? So one thing to say is that I think that these kinds of simple explanations do in fact ignore environmental and social influences that are central in all psychological explanations, including evolutionary ones, right? I don't think that you can fully understand why women are less represented in power positions or in STEM disciplines without understanding historical barriers to entry in those kinds of positions, right? So whatever is true about our evolved psychological architecture, our psychologies are situated within those contexts. And I think it's undeniable that that's an important influence here. Another way that I think these claims are wrong is that they reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of biological explanations. So an evolutionary understanding of psychology is actually not biologically deterministic, right? Evolutionary explanations are inherently interactionist, meaning that they center on the interaction of evolved mechanisms and architectures with specific environments and contexts. And so the implicit assumption of many of these problematic claims that we're talking about is that they're sort of implying that a biological difference means an immutable one, right? So they can point to, say, a structural brain difference between men and women or something, and conclude that the difference is therefore hardwired. And no matter what we do, women are just going to be bad at spatial reasoning because brains, right? But in actuality, a biological difference is not straightforward evidence of hardwiring. And nowhere is this truer than in the brain, right? Many neural differences that were once mistaken for hardwired differences have turned out to be the result of different experiences. And this is not surprising when you consider that everything that you learn, every skill that you build, and every trauma that you sustain is physically encoded in your brain, right? There's some really interesting research on London taxi drivers who apparently have enormous hippocampal volumes, which is an area of the brain that's heavily implicated in long-term memory storage, right? This is not because people with huge hippocampi become taxi drivers, right? It's because of the navigational expertise they develop, which creates a dramatic structural change in the brain, right? And likewise, while there are a number of sex-differentiated structures in the brain, it is a very complicated business to sort out the causes of those specific differences, right? Some differences are influenced by hormones during prenatal development. Some differences are influenced by hormones during pubertal development, and others are influenced by the divergent experiences that people have in their lives as a function of living as a particular gender, right? And of course, none of these are either or influences either, right? Many gender differences are influenced by all of those factors, right? So the take-home point here is that evolutionary explanations do not exclude culture and learning in how they explain behavior, and they're actually not biologically or genetically deterministic. And I think that where you see people making claims that they are, right, I think it's worth being suspicious of those claims. Right. Okay. So moving on to the criticism that inspired the title of my talk, right? So some folks claim that evolutionary psychology hypotheses are less scientific hypotheses than they are just sort of just so stories about how we developed certain characteristics. So I screen grabbed this article because I like its opening lines and how it articulates this criticism. So this author says, if you put your mind to it just a little, you could probably sit down and compose a research article in the field of evolutionary psychology right now, off the top of your head. It's easy. And the article goes on to say that evolutionary psychology doesn't test hypotheses as much as it retrofits evolutionary stories to glaringly obvious observations. And so I think another way to frame this argument is that just because you can tell a nice evolutionary story about something doesn't mean it's an adaptation, right? There are alternative explanations for various features of the mind, which is true. And I actually don't think that evolutionary psychologists fail to recognize this, right? But I do think it's an important objection to address because, as we mentioned, we do see this long history of misusing evolutionary language to prop up bad ideas. And that kind of lazy armchair theorizing, I think, does deserve to be called out everywhere that it is observed, right? But I don't actually think this is a fair criticism of the academic literature in evolutionary psychology in general, right? So first, it's actually not the case that evolutionary hypotheses are primarily derived from observing glaringly obvious things in daily life, right? As in other disciplines, hypotheses are formulated on a foundation of existing theory and evidence, right? And second, the hypothesis is just the beginning, right? What comes next, right? That process of testing hypotheses, ruling out alternative explanations, that's really where the science is done, right? And I think another angle on this criticism that I want to address is really a criticism of psychology as opposed to evolutionary psychology in particular. So I've heard some folks, including some evolutionary biologists, saying that because we are limited to examining psychological mechanisms in modern humans, there's no way that we can make inferences about the evolutionary history of those mechanisms, right? And I think this is interesting because I don't think that it's controversial to say that when you're studying physical structures in modern organisms, that we can in fact make inferences about how and why those structures developed over evolutionary time, right? And whether it was shaped by natural selection or not. And if it was shaped by natural selection, for what purpose, right? There are scientific tools available to do that kind of reverse engineering in biology. But some folks seem skeptical that you can apply this method for psychological structures, right? And so what I'd say to this is that, the methods by which evolved psychological structures are identified and studied are actually highly analogous to those employed in the study of physical structures, right? The main difference is that we're also having to use this tradition of psychological methods that we use to infer internal processes, right? So if your problem is with that, that's just a problem with psychology in general. That's not evo-psych specific, right? But if you accept that, right, then here's what I would say. Evolutionary psychologists, like evolutionary biologists, look for things like ubiquity, developmental regularity, and hallmarks of design when they're collecting evidence for whether a behavioral or psychological trait is an evolved adaptation. Evolutionary psychologists are also careful not to conflate adaptation with helpful, right? This is another criticism I've heard, because there are lots of helpful behaviors that are not adaptations, right? Like the ability to read printed text. This is very unlikely to be an adaptation in and of itself. It's probably a byproduct of verbal language abilities, right? And there are also plenty of adaptations that are not helpful in the modern environment, right? So the preference for sugar, you see that in humans very strongly, lots of other species as well. There's plenty of evidence that this is an evolved preference, but in an environment with unlimited access to sugar, right, it's not very helpful. It can contribute to health problems. So evolutionary psychologists are no less aware than any other evolutionary researchers that there is a standard of evidence here for establishing whether something is a psychological adaptation beyond simply it's helpful and I can think of a plausible sounding story to explain it, right? And this leads me to the second part of my talk. So I've made some assertions now about why I think the field stands up to these criticisms. And now I want to give you some evidence for those assertions. So in particular, I want to take you through a couple of really interesting research areas in evolutionary psychology that I think demonstrate both the firm grounding in existing theory and evidence from other areas, and the added value that I think psychological methodology brings to this multidisciplinary effort of applying evolutionary theory to the understanding of the human experience. So first thing I want to talk about is kin recognition, which I love this area, and I think it exemplifies all of these strengths of evolutionary psychology. So the central questions in the kin recognition research are how humans distinguish relatives from non-relatives, which is important from a fitness standpoint because it tells us two things, right? It tells us who to be especially nice to, right? It's actually directly genetically beneficial for me to help my brother survive because we share 50% of our unique genes, right? The second thing that it tells me to be able to distinguish kin from non-kin is who I should not mate with, right? This is very important because mating with close relatives is likely to produce offspring that have very severe problems. Usually, when two close relatives mate, like siblings, and they have offspring, those offspring do not survive, right? So being able to figure out who our kin are is really important. And so there have been strong selective pressures to allow animals to do this reliably, right? And it turns out there's a bunch of different mechanisms that can do this reliably. So a number of rodents, like golden hamsters, those are the cute little guys in the top picture, they use something called phenotypic matching, right? Which means that they're using trait similarity to assess genetic similarity and therefore to drive these kin-directed behaviors. So golden hamsters in particular use odor similarity to distinguish who their genetic relatives are, right? Red squirrels also use phenotypic matching of a different sort. So they do matching on the basis of vocalizations, which are, apparently individually distinct in red squirrels, which is kind of fun, right? So phenotypic matching via vocalization, right? Other animals use a different kind of cue. Right. So they use something called spatial cues or associative cues in order to determine who their kin are. So in the slide there is a Belding's ground squirrel, and they use associative cues to infer genetic relatedness. So in this species, right, whoever is present in your den or burrow during early development is highly likely to be a genetic relative, right? And so association during early development seems to trigger later kin-directed behavior, like avoiding those animals as mates, right? And if you're wondering how researchers have distinguished between that association cue and odor similarity as causes here, because usually they're confounded, right? They've done these experiments where they take some ground squirrels from this litter over here and some ground squirrels from this litter over here, and they switch them and do this sort of fostering. And by using a method like that, they can essentially distinguish which cue is more operative in distinguishing kin from non-kin, right? So if odor is driving it, then they shouldn't treat their adoptive litter mates as kin, but in fact they do. And so it seems to be this association during early development that's driving that behavior, right? So there are a variety of mechanisms the animals can use to recognize kin, but which do humans use? Do we sniff out our siblings, right? Or are we using associative cues or something like that? So some of the early research on this, just fascinating stuff, comes out of anthropology. One early hypothesis that was relevant to this kin recognition question specifically focused on what causes people to avoid close relatives as mates, right? Which we noted before is an important adaptive function of kin recognition. And so this one hypothesis called the Western hypothesis, suggesting that people don't avoid sexual contact with relatives because of cultural taboos, which was a dominant idea at the time. Freud believed that, right? That if we didn't have incest taboos, we would all sleep with our mothers and things. So the Western work hypothesis said, no, it's not cultural taboos. I think that there's some sort of reverse imprinting that's happening between siblings during early development. So in other words, he suggested that we reverse imprint sexually on our siblings because of that close association in childhood. And then when we grow up, we're not sexually attracted to them. So in most cultures, it would be really difficult to tease these two explanations apart because incest taboos are ubiquitous, and usually children who are raised in the same household are siblings. And so these two explanations in a lot of cultures are confounded, right? So how do we evaluate which is causal here, right? Well, some anthropologists took advantage of these really unique cultural arrangements that allowed them to tease these things apart. So in one study, the anthropologist Arthur Wolf examined marital satisfaction and number of children produced in two forms of traditional arranged marriages in Taiwan. So in the first form, marriages were arranged shortly after a child was born. And then at a very young age, often during infancy, the future bride was sort of adopted into the family of the future groom. And so the bride and groom lived together in the same household until they were old enough to marry, right? So in other words, they're being raised kind of like siblings. In the second form of marriage, it was still arranged, right? But the marriage was arranged as adults, so they're not growing up in the same household. And what Wolf discovered through both qualitative reports by locals and in an analysis of town records of divorces and births was that first form of marriage in which the bride and the groom are being raised like siblings have profoundly lower marital satisfaction, much lower birth rates, and much higher rates of divorce. And boy, the qualitative reports that he was getting from the locals were very vivid and suggested that, like, The wedding night for these kids was very traumatic. They begged their parents not to force them to consummate the relationship. They tried to escape from the room, and the parents had to beat them with sticks to get back in. It's awful. So in other words, they behaved exactly the way that you would probably imagine you would behave if someone was trying to force you to consummate a relationship with your sibling. So Wolf interpreted this as evidence that's consistent with the Westermark hypothesis, right? You've got a cultural pressure that's driving kids in one direction. They're encouraged to get married, but you have this childhood association that is creating such a strong barrier, right? That culture is not overriding that kind of circuitry, right? Similar observations have been made in a variety of other cultural arrangements. So the second picture there is of an Israeli kibbutzim, right? This is a communal living arrangement where groups of children are raised together in classes. So they live in the same house, they eat together, they sleep together. And just like in these arranged marriages that we see, they virtually never develop any sexual interest in each other as adults, right? Even though there's no cultural prohibition around that, right? So I love this early anthropology stuff, and it lays some really compelling groundwork for there being an inherited adaptation that's taking this information about childhood association, transforming it into this estimation of kinship, and then leading to these kin-directed behaviors, right? But the evidence from these studies is still pretty gross, right? So what we need now is some more granular investigations of what this mechanism looks like and how it functions, right? And that's where we need to bring in psychology. So there's been a lot of research on this. I'm going to focus on one study by Lieberman and colleagues who hypothesized that we have this kinship estimation module that works as that model on the right depicts. So we're taking several inputs or cues that are related to genetic relatedness. That information is then transformed into an estimate of relatedness, and then that regulates kin-directed behavior like sexual attraction and altruistic motivations. So if the kinship estimation is high, then sexual attraction would be suppressed, altruistic behavior would be facilitated, and if it's low, then this mechanism would not suppress sexual attraction or facilitate altruistic behavior. And so you'll notice that in this model, Lieberman and colleagues specified 3 kinds of cues that might feed into this kinship estimation. So the first cue is length of co-residence in childhood, which we've already talked about, right? The second, this is a new one, it's a different kind of associative cue called maternal perinatal association. It's a mouthful, but it refers to the observations that older siblings can make of their younger siblings. So that is watching their mother, who they have a confidence linked to genetically, become pregnant and then nurse and care for a younger sibling, right? So MPA is an even more reliable cue statistically to genetic relatedness than co-residence is. And so they predicted that when MPA is present, when you have a younger sibling and you've co-resided with them since birth, that ought to be the strongest predictor of kin-directed behavior. So this third box in the model says additional cues. So here they're leaving open the possibility that there are other inputs that could feed into this kinship estimation mechanism in certain situations. So like phenotypic similarity, explicit beliefs about relatedness, and so on. Okay. So to assess this model, Lieberman and colleagues collected information from over 650 participants regarding their family composition in a variety of ways. So they evaluated how many siblings they had, their siblings' ages, and whether they were biological siblings, step-siblings, or adopted, how long they had co-resided, and during what ages. And they also evaluated 3 specific outcome variables. So they evaluated altruism toward siblings, and they evaluated both like past behaviors as well as future intentions toward altruism. Second, they evaluated judgments of moral wrongness when the participants read vignettes depicting third-party incest, right? So consensual sexual activity between siblings. And then finally, they evaluated feelings of disgust when they asked participants to imagine sexual acts with another sibling. So boy, this is a really fun study to participate in, I would imagine. All right, and here's what they found. So they found that the longer the participants co-resided with siblings, the more altruism and incest-related disgust and judgments of moral wrongness they reported, right? So that's consistent with past research. And interestingly, this was true regardless of whether the siblings were biological or step siblings or adopted siblings. So explicit beliefs about relatedness did not seem to matter as much here as that co-residence cue, right? That was still predicting kinship-related outcomes. And interestingly, I thought this was cool. They did not find evidence that there was like a critical window in development during which co-residence had like an especially powerful effect, right? So like with the imprinting mechanism with goslings, that takes place in a very narrow window after hatching, right? This doesn't seem to work the same way. It seemed to be number of years that siblings co-resided that mattered and not the ages at which they co-resided, right? Okay, and then finally, the MPA, right? So the presence of this MPA cue of, living with a younger sibling since birth very strongly predicted these kin-directed behaviors of altruism and incest-related disgust. And when they only looked at those participants that had the MPA cue present, they found that the number of years of co-residence no longer mattered in terms of predicting these kin-related outcomes. So regardless of how long they had lived with the sibling, if they had the MPA cue, it predicted strongly these kin-directed behaviors. And so this indicates, right, that as hypothesized, that because MPA is a statistically much more reliable indicator of genetic relatedness, it seems to be preferentially feeding into that kinship estimation when it's there. So the strength of this evidence, I think, the reason that I like this kin recognition stuff so much is for a few reasons. So first of all, it's built on this really strong theoretical foundation from evolutionary biology, right? And it's also built on this strong empirical foundation from these experimental studies in animal behavior and this cross-cultural comparisons from anthropology. And then the psychological research that's been built on top of it, it complements and extends this existing research by quantitatively teasing apart these contributors from childhood environment and providing greater specificity about what this mechanism looks like, right, and how it works, which I think is great. All right, so one more example for you about babies. If you have a baby, or if you've spent any time with any babies, one thing that I think you will have noticed is that they have a marked attraction to novelty, right? They really are big explorers of their environments, and some of their favorite ways of exploring their environments are to stick as many things into their mouths as they can and grab everything that's within grabbing distance and so on. But interestingly, they do show a marked reluctance to do this when it comes to one category of objects, which is plants. And so if you see that image on the bottom there, if you haven't looked at the YouTube montages of parents trying to put their babies on grass, you need to look that up because they do this. They really don't like it. And it's fascinating, right? So this developmental researcher, Annie Wirtz, has been conducting this fascinating series of studies to explore this avoidance that infants show with plants. And her hypothesis is that infants have a behavioral immune system that prevents them from interacting with novel plants, to essentially treat all novel plants as though they were potentially dangerous, right? So why would they do that? Well, plants have been a ubiquitous part of our environments over our natural history, and we have a complicated relationship with plants, so we need them. They're an important resource for us in terms of diet and materials to manufacture things, right? So we need them, but they're also constantly trying to kill us. So lots of plants are poisonous if ingested, and there are lots of plants that are dangerous even if you touch them, right? So the tree in the picture on the right here is a manchineel tree, which produces very potent toxins that are highly irritating to the skin and eyes. So if you're standing under a manchineel tree and it's raining, and a drop of rain slides down one of the leaves and gets some of these toxins and then lands on your skin, that can be enough to cause blistering, right? And higher exposures to the toxins can produce severe damage to skin and eyes, right? And no surprise, that little fruit that looks so nice on that tree in the picture is fatal if ingested. So not all plants are this dangerous, but plenty of them are. And the really big problem is that there aren't any reliable glaring features of dangerous plants that distinguish them from safe plants, right? The dangerous plants don't, grow with big red X's on them to let us know that we can't touch them, right? So we do develop highly sophisticated knowledge of which plants are okay to interact with, and we do this through cultural transmission, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But when we come into this world as infants, we don't know which are safe and which are dangerous. And so Annie Wirtz hypothesizes that we may have these specific cognitive adaptations that produce both behavioral aversion to novel plants, so treat all novel plants as though they're potentially dangerous, and adaptations to do social referencing when we're encountering novel plants. In other words, to try to get information from others about whether or not this plant is dangerous. Right. So how has she explored this hypothesis? In an early experiment, she conducted these sessions with infants that were aged like 8 to 18 months. And as you can see in those pictures on the right, the infants were seated in the lap of their caregiver, right? And their caregiver is instructed prior to the sessions to keep their eyes closed during the session, maintain a neutral facial expression, don't react to anything that's happening. And the infants are facing an experimenter across the table, right? And then one at a time, the experimenter, who's also maintaining a neutral facial expression, presents a series of objects to the infant, puts them within arm's reach of the infant, right? And I'll show you some pictures of those in a minute. And the question that Wirtz wanted to investigate here was whether infants showed more reluctance to make physical contact with plants compared to other objects. So in these trials, right, she used a couple of real plants, right, basil and oregano, if I'm remembering correctly. And she used a couple of very realistic but artificial plants, right? And so she did this because it's possible that infants aren't reacting to visual cues of plants. Maybe they're reacting to like an odor cue that's causing them to avoid them. And so using artificial plants helps to rule this out. She also included a couple of other things that helped her to evaluate some different potential mechanisms that could be triggering this aversion. So she had some natural artifacts. In this particular study, she just used shells, different types of shells. So these are not man-made, but they're also not plants. And this helps her to evaluate whether, I don't know, maybe infants are avoiding all natural objects and it's not just plants. So this difference would allow her to evaluate that. She also included familiar man-made artifacts, so like lamps, spoons, hairbrushes, things that the infant would have been likely to encounter before. And this helps her to evaluate whether infants are avoiding plants because they're familiar, right? Because we know they love novelty. Maybe they're just bored with the plants. Maybe they're not treating them as though they're dangerous. So using objects like this helps her to potentially rule that out. And then finally, if you look over there on the far right, we've got some pictures of very strange objects that kind of look like alien craft projects, right? I call these novel artifacts. And these were interesting, right? Because each of these novel artifacts shared some features with plants, but not others. So some of them had like leaves and stems, so plant-like structures, but they weren't colored like natural plants are. So they were like black and blue instead of green. Other objects were green, but they didn't have a particularly plant-like structure, so they didn't have leaves. And so the infant's reaction to these kinds of objects allows her to sort of distinguish between different features of plants that could be causing aversion, right? Okay, so again, she was presenting infants with these objects one at a time, and the object remained in front of the infant on the table until one of two things happened. So it remained on the table until the infant touched it, at which point the trial was ended, the object was removed, and then it was replaced with another object, or for a maximum of 30 seconds. So if the infant didn't touch the object within 30 seconds, it was removed, and then they went on to the next trial, right? So what's displayed in these results graphs are the average trial durations for each of these types of objects. So the larger the trial duration, the higher the point on that graph, and the longer it took the infants to touch that category of objects on average. And as you can see, compared to all the other categories of objects, infants were most hesitant to touch the real and the realistic looking artificial plants, right? What's not obvious from just looking at these numbers, though, is like how dramatic the behavioral difference is. So I've seen some of the videos from these experiments, and when they put a hairbrush in front of them, immediately the infant reaches out, grabs it, sticks it in their mouth, and they're having a great time. When they put plants in front of them, they do something very different. So they look at the plant, and then they look up at their caregiver, and again, they have their eyes closed, they're not doing anything, so they're not getting anything there. And then they look over at the experimenter, they're not doing anything. And then they like maybe reach a finger, like they're gonna touch the plant, they're watching the experimenter for cues, and they're not doing anything. And so most of the time, they just don't touch the plants. Like it's a very striking difference in their behavior, right? So In subsequent experiments, Annie Wirtz demonstrated that the way that infants learn which plants they can stop treating as potentially dangerous is through social learning. So she's documented systematically the fact that when they are presented with plants versus control objects, infants do significantly more social referencing. That means looking up to get feedback from a caregiver or another adult. And they use that social feedback to guide their behavior. So if they get positive social feedback, then they'll approach the plant. If they get negative social feedback or no feedback, then they don't touch the plant, right? So what is yet to be determined about this, that she's continuing to do research on now, is what feature or set of features characterizes plants are activating this aversion. And because there isn't one shared feature across all plants, it's likely to be a combination of things, right? So leaves, greenness, all those things, in combination could trigger this aversion that was designed to get infants to avoid plants. So she's doing a variety of really interesting follow-up work in this line of research. She's doing cross-cultural comparisons, which is very important, I think, for a mechanism like this that is so heavily culturally influenced and depends on social learning. So, it's possible that in a culture where there's a lot more plant exposure and greater cultural knowledge about plants, that this learning process might look different, right? It could be accelerated. There's a variety of ways that it could be different. So she's doing that work now. She's also doing this work outside the lab, right? So in naturalistic settings that more resemble where this mechanism was hypothesized to evolve. And she's doing comparative work. So she's looking at what plant interactions look like in non-human apes, primarily. And so, again, like kin recognition, I think this is another question for which converging evidence is critical, right? The study I described today, it's a highly controlled lab study, right? It's designed to provide, strong mechanistic evidence about this cognitive adaptation and what it looks like and how it functions. And I think this is one of the strengths that psychological research brings to questions like this. But these other kinds of evidence are also critical, right? It's the convergent evidence that I think really allows you to make a strong case for this behavioral tendency as an inherited cognitive adaptation. So some closing thoughts. I hope that these research examples give you a sense of why I find this approach to psychology so compelling and fascinating. And I hope that they also persuasively illustrate what psychology in particular has to offer in the context of evolutionary science more broadly, right? Evidence from archaeology and anthropology and ethology provide critical insights, I think, into our species' evolutionary history. And I think psychology does as well, right? And finally, I hope that if you were watching today and hoping that I would address concerns that you've had about this area, right, perhaps because of the sort of public face of evolutionary psychology, I hope that you feel that I did them justice. And if I didn't, I hope that I hear from you in the Q&A. So thank you very much. Here are some podcasts that I do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. That was an absolutely excellent talk. We're now going to have a 15-minute break so that everyone can refresh their glasses. During the break, don't forget to submit your questions via sitp.online/ask or upvote any questions you'd like to see asked. And we'll be back at 8:05. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you're all feeling refreshed and ready for the Q&A. So I think we're going to go straight in here with a question from Igor, who's asked, can you describe in your angriest voice the worst example of misuse of evolutionary psychology in the wild?
This is a wonderful question. My angry voice. Igor must know that I can't do this on cue. So there was actually an example. There are some bad examples, so it's a little bit hard to choose. But there is an example that I thought about putting in the talk tonight, which was, it's not a peer-reviewed study, but it was a study that was published on Psychology Today, or an analysis, I should say, that was published on Psychology Today several years ago. And the title of the article that was published, I believe, was "Why Are Black Women Less Attractive?" which was excellent. So the whole premise was like they analyzed some data from this longitudinal study of adolescents, and for whatever reason found this the fact that like all races of women. These pictures of women were like had about equivalent attractiveness, but that for whatever reason, the Black women in this data set got lower. And then they just like spun this whole evolutionary sounding story, like trying to manufacture why that would be the case. And it was awful. It was truly awful. And I mean, there was an outcry from within the area about it. Like there was an open letter that was published that was like, "Hey, this is not evolutionary psychology. Like, please, this person is not of us." So that's one of the first examples that sprang to mind for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that wasn't even adult women. It was adolescents that study was, and the study wasn't designed to look into that. It was secondary data. So just for many reasons, it was bloody terrible.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Cleo, and she says, I've heard that mothers and sons first meeting as adults are not uncommonly sexually attracted to each other. This seems maladaptive. Can it be explained?
Beautiful question. I think follows directly from the things we were talking about, right? So we don't infer genetic relatedness directly, right? Those cues come from these sort of associative mechanisms. And so, yeah, I've seen these cases as well where mothers and their sons are like separated at birth, right? Given up for adoption. They meet as adults and then they, become sexually attracted to each other and have a romantic relationship. And I would say it's because that barrier isn't there, right? Like those cues were not able to sort of form that barrier against incestuous behavior, right? And also, the one thing that I talk about in my classes a lot with kin recognition is that if we didn't have those kinds of mechanisms, there are lots of other mechanisms that seem to operate in interpersonal attraction that could make it more likely that you'd be attracted to relatives, right? Because like we're attracted to similarity in a variety of ways, and a variety of other things. So like, yes, without specific mechanisms in place to prevent attraction, right, it's actually very likely to happen otherwise. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, because it happens with siblings as well who have been separated at birth, who like if they've not had that cue to relatedness, they don't develop that aversion.
Absolutely.
And like it's compared to a lot of species, like we don't have particularly strong olfactory senses, so there's no way of using that. So it is just that situational cue more than anything else.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Anonymous, who asks, if we are evolutionary evolved not to be incestuous, why do we have so many? Do you have any insight on why incest porn is so hugely popular?
Yeah, I wonder if Anonymous is trying to scoop my next research line. I literally just a couple of weeks ago was thinking about this, apropos of nothing. Because yes, right, like this is a huge category, not only in like video porn, but in erotica. And written erotic porn, right? But what I have noticed primarily is that the most popular categories there seem to be step relationships, and so in those relationships, you're much more likely to have situations where the duration of cohabitation is lower, right? And so that's that kinship estimator mechanism, right, isn't activated as strongly if you haven't been co-residing for as long. And so I think that attraction is likely to happen in situations like that. And if there's a taboo against it, which there is, right, then you're much more likely to see people, looking for outlets that allow them to sort of explore those possibilities. So yeah, that's my thought.
I'm looking forward to that paper. Our next question comes from David. And they ask, do you have any examples of a psychological trait in humans for which the evolutionary origins in our non-human ancestors has been proven?
So let's see. I think I could read this question in a couple of different ways. I mean, I would say there's actually more traits than not for which the origins are thought to be much older than our species, right? And so in like the kinship literature there, right, those associative mechanisms did not originate with humans, right? Those are much older. There are some other things that are thought to be newer that have to do with like sort of hierarchical social arrangements and things like that. But I don't know, Kat, do you have another read on what this question might be getting at there?
No, it does tap on the fact that I guess it's looking at things that may be apparent
both in humans and in our cousins, because obviously, so we have common ancestors with chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, but obviously there are no currently living ancestors because they're our ancestors, they're gone. So I'm trying to think of things that we know have been verified in our cousins. And I'm drawing a blank.
I mean, I feel like I'm hitting the same things I said before, but things like evolved taste preferences, those are all, I think, sort of demonstrably older, right? Like having that sort of instinctive preference for sweetness. I think that you see that in some of our closest cousins, so you can infer that's older, right? But
yeah,
I don't know.
I think there's also the slight problem of that when we're looking at evolutionary psychology, a lot of the stuff that's really firm, that you can really get a grip on, it's like people start going, no, that's evolutionary biology. Like, no, no, that's ours as well. I think.
Yeah, we claim that. We claim that. But it's, it's an interesting observation though, because one of the things that I've really come to is that when people say like, well, you can't use psychological methods to support this. I mean, I think it's true that a lot of the best work comes from that convergent evidence, right? Yeah. I mean, we can do the specialized set of things as psychologists, and I think that the fact that the entire enterprise of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary science in humans, like, I think it's a strength that what we're looking at is kind of multidisciplinary. So,
I'd absolutely agree with that. I think I like to think of psychology as almost a branch of biology, because it is just the things that are caused by one particular organ. And it's, so if we were talking about hearts or lungs or anything like that, it's biology, but because it's brains, it's psychology, but it's still the activity of an organ.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, our next question comes from Hassan, and they ask, what topics are currently still debatable in the field of evolutionary psychology?
I would like to hear your response to this as well. I think that there are a lot of open areas of inquiry in evolutionary psychology. I mean, it's a fairly young discipline, right? And so I think that there are, oh man, how dark do we want to get here? There is some work in the arena of sexual violence, right, in which a number of hypotheses have been put forward to explain that. I am not under the impression that there are really definitive settled answers from an adaptive perspective on questions like that. I think there are questions of sexuality in terms of like diversity of sexualities, right? There were some hypotheses put forward about homosexuality being an adaptation, shaped by kin selection, right? As far as I know, that's still I don't think that we have settled answers on things like this, but there's a lot of questions like that, I believe, right? Oh, status stuff is sort of like that too. Status driving mechanisms, really interesting open area. Yeah.
Yeah, the two that leap immediately to my mind are religion and homicide.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the homicide stuff is so interesting. Like I haven't looked at it in a while because I've been focusing more on religion. But there's an argument about whether are we like evolved, or is there an adaptation to murder under certain circumstances?
Yeah.
Or under certain circumstances, are we more likely to behave in impulsive ways, which will result in a homicide?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting area. And I think it's one of the areas that highlights kind of like a blurring of the lines in evolutionary psychology, because it depends how pedantic and academic you want to get about it.
Yeah.
Because there's different approaches that fall under human evolutionary studies. And so there's cultural evolution, there's human behavioral ethology, and there's evolutionary psychology. Yeah. And they all have very slightly different takes on things, which if you are outside of the field, they look exactly the same, but inside the field, like suddenly it's like, but I think there does necessarily need to be a bit of a blurring, because for some approach, for some topics, one approach might be better than the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that's before you get into the problem of deciding what's an adaptation and what's a byproduct, and what's adaptive but not an adaptation.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Oh, and the religion one's really cool too. Like, I was reading some about that not too long ago. Do you want to state publicly whether you're in camp adaptation or byproduct? No, I'll take my answer off the air.
I still haven't decided. I think there are certainly adaptive outcomes of religion. Like, religion can certainly give us benefits. Whether religion has evolved because of those benefits originally, or whether that it's because of byproducts or a combination, and there's been some cultural evolution in there. And I've also got to tackle whether group selection is an acceptable idea these days.
I'll also take my answer on that off the air.
Just for that might have been a bit too niche. So in evolution, there's the argument that you should take the gene's eye view, and the smallest unit of selection is an animal, which is pretty much the classical understanding of evolution. But there is group selection, which has renamed itself as multi-level selection, which suggests that groups of humans can compete against other groups of humans, and that can lead to evolution as well, just for anyone that was wondering. So went a bit off on one there, sorry. Our next question is from Andrew, and they ask, babies and plants. That suggests there was a time in our history where we were killing a lot of kids with plants for it to be so hardwired. When was that thing?
You're asking the tough questions here, Andrew. So I would say, so as far as I know, Annie Wirtz has not published any of her comparative work yet, right? She has some of those studies underway, but without knowing a little bit more about that side of it, I think this is a hard question to answer. So I think it's very possible that this is an older adaptation, right? And that this did not originate with humans. That there are sort of some older mechanisms here that are being manifested. But I don't know. There are some adaptations I think that are hypothesized to have emerged with the emergence of modern, like, Homo sapiens, essentially. So I don't know when this was. Do you know when this was, Kat?
Oh, not a clue. I couldn't even hazard a guess. I'd imagine that changes in olfactory sensitivity would have been a key part in that.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I really like the research on because taste is quite a good cue as well. And research looking at, like, cruciferous vegetables and how children tend to have quite a strong aversion to, like, those really dark green vegetables. Right. But as they get older, like, they're more able, they find it more palatable. And it's because I can't remember the name of the chemicals, but they are actually toxic in high enough doses.
Something. Yeah, I know what you're talking. No, there's a more specific one for bitterness. I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember either.
So if baby is refusing to eat sprouts, it's because baby does not want to be poisoned. Thank you very much.
Hey, that answers the next question. Yeah, that's good.
Oh, oops. So our next question is from Paul, and they say Richard Dawkins has said we can and should rebel against our evolutionary impulses. To what extent do you think this undermines evolutionary psychology?
I don't see that speaking directly to. I don't think this is an undermining of evolutionary psychology, because again, like, this is a couple of things wrapped up in this. Like, I don't think that the implication of any research in evolutionary psychology should be that we are this way, therefore it's good, right? We've touched on a couple of topics already. If there are adaptations to murder, right? If there are adaptations regarding, the influence, like sexually violent behavior and things like that, that in no way suggests that, like, well, we should accept that, right? that it's not a fatalistic kind of explanation of our behavior. So I remember this quote from Dawkins, and I'm trying to remember the context of it, but I think that was the context, right? That we have a number of mechanisms that I think are at odds with the kind of world that we want to live in, and that we shouldn't be thinking about this framework fatalistically, right? That's my interpretation anyway. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that would be my interpretation of it as well. It's the old is ought problem. Like,
yes.
We're in the business of describing what is, not telling you what to do.
Right.
Yeah. So our next question comes from David. And they ask, since we cannot directly observe the evolution of psychological traits, what evidence does evolutionary psychology use to validate or refute theoretical propositions?
Yes. Right. So it's a great question. And I mean, so I'd say I'd go back to some of the early stuff that I was talking about in the talk, right? So there could be two things that you're sort of getting at in this question. One is about the fact that many psychological things have to be inferred indirectly, right? And we have several decades of research that have sort of equipped us, I think, with the tools to do that, right? But when you're talking about like when the evaluation of some psychological trait or behavioral tendency is an adaptation, you're doing that, I think, through the lens of function, right? So looking at Annie Wertz's research, for example, right? She's got this hypothesis that we have this cognitive module to avoid novel plants, right? And so that suggests that when we encounter things with plant-like features, and again, it's not clear like exactly what those features are yet, but when we encounter things with plant-like features that we haven't encountered before as infants, that's going to trigger this response. So she's sort of sketched out what this cognitive module looks like. And then she's setting up in these experiments, these controlled conditions that allow her to test like whether those assumptions are true about the function, right? So that's how you're sketching out the these differential hypotheses about what's guiding this stuff. It's function, right?
Yeah, I think some of the stuff that I think is quite good for that is also physical attractiveness, because a lot of what we find physically attractive does seem to map on to some extent to genetic fitness. In that, like, people with more symmetrical faces tend to have a better history of health. Like they have a better immune system, and waist to hip ratio being a decent indicator of hormone levels and fertility. So I quite like them as examples.
Yeah, no, those are good examples.
Our next question comes from Bremer. And they ask, what is the best argument that people who dislike evolutionary psychology have, and what is your counter argument to them?
I think, and again, Kat, I would be interested in your answer to this question, but I think that the argument that I presented about centering cultural influence and social influence is probably, I think, the one that needs to be engaged with most strongly. I referenced at the beginning of the talk that like my thinking about evolutionary psychology has gotten more elaborated and complex over time. And I think that when I was first learning about it, the trap that I fell into most often was not considering those influences enough, right? So I think it's very important to make sure that we are constantly centering those things as influences on behavior. And to the extent that we forget to do that sometimes, right, that is genuinely a problem, and we need to step back from things and recenter. So, yeah, I think the argument that culture is powerful is important, and culture is incredibly powerful. But I like the idea that I think one of my favorite examples of how evolution and culture go perfectly hand in hand is when you look at language. Like, we
all have this natural propensity for language, and it develops at a very predictable rate, regardless of what culture you're in.
Yeah.
But the details are informed by the culture and what you're surrounded by, like
Absolutely.
what language you end up speaking. And it just perfectly marries up. Like, hey, we've got this like architecture, this evolutionary architecture, and here's the cultural information, and it comes together and it produces this fantastic thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, right? Like, I mean, I feel like it's very parallel to the plants thing too, right? Because that is absolutely that's absolutely an adaptation that, as you said, provides the architecture or the framework, and we have the flexibility to fill in details, which I think it's great.
Yeah. Our next question is from Igor, and they ask, is there a palpable difference in behaviours that evolutionary psychology is interested in between humans and other species?
I think that Igor's making a pun about palps, which is something that has come up on our Twitch stream a lot. We have a lot of spider palp conversations over there, which is really fun. Palpable differences between like the kinds of questions animals and humans. I mean, well, so I think that there's a lot of overlap in some questions, but there are, as we referenced a few minutes ago, I think that there are certain questions that, at least at the moment, seem like they are unique to humans, where we're digging into. And so things about, I've been recently in the literature about status striving, and potential mechanisms by which humans sort of compete for status or try to gain leadership positions. And that represents a divergence in some ways from the questions that I think have been explored in non-human animals. Not that there's non-human species have dominant structures, but they look different in some interesting ways in humans. So I think there are a number of more recent adaptations that we're examining in human, or potential adaptations that we're examining in humans that we're not examining in other species. So I assume that question was just an excuse to say palpable, which I appreciate. But
for those of us that don't know, what's a spider palp?
Oh, it's like I've been corrected on this, so I've been calling them spider. Can I say a crude word, or is that not allowed on this?
Feel free.
Okay, so I've been calling them
science.
Yes, I've been calling them spider dicks, but I was corrected on that. But they are essentially protuberances that are used to inseminate female spiders. So I think that it's an appropriate slang term to apply to a palp, but some people disagree with me. So
physically fighting the urge to take you off on a tangent about like weird animal sex, because
about the palps falling off. Yeah, that's the best.
Just generally, animals, they do some weird stuff. Like,
they do. I've got plans for a children's book on puberty and reproduction that is species inclusive, so that human kids feel better when they think they're going through all these weird changes and it's upsetting. They can just look at other species and be like, well, not so bad. It's good puberty.
Our next question is from Anonymous. They ask, is the anti-close relative only in mammals? I'd assume most frogs, fish, prawns, for example, don't care, but does it change their reproductive behavior?
So, like, are there incest avoidance mechanisms in non-mammal species?
Yes, I think, in non-mammals.
Okay, I am not brushed up on my non-mammal examples on this, but I would venture to say yes. It might depend on, obviously it depends on the species. I don't feel comfortable giving a strong answer to this, but like first principles, I'd say this is probably not specific to mammals, right?
I wouldn't know where to start with that question. Our next question comes from Linda, and they ask, how does a tradition like the Taiwanese Simpa get started if it's so awful?
Oh, wow. I mean, we have a lot of traditions like that. They're pretty awful. I don't know a lot about the history of this tradition, right? But I do know that there have been many traditions, many of them focusing on marriage for reasons that are maybe not incidental, that are not conducive to human flourishing necessarily, but serve some other kind of purpose. So, yeah, that's my vague answer to that. You have any thoughts on that?
I wonder whether it's about like trying to form your in-group and keep your in-group close. Although we're treading quite close to group selection if I go further down that road. Although it's an example of where that clearly wouldn't work.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Actually, that's interesting. So it could be sort of like a mechanism to try to get control over female sexual purity. Right.
That would be interesting.
That could be a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't work all that well. Yeah.
Our next question is from Parrot Lady. And they say, you mentioned that the novel objects in the study were chosen to help distinguish between plant features. What was the outcome there, albeit at a small scale?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because I wanted to talk about it, and I was trying to cut my talk down in time. So it was interesting. The novel plants, or the novel artifacts there, still showed less aversion than the actual plants or the realistic artificial plants. And so if some of those features were operating, it clearly wasn't all of the features that were operating, right? So it wasn't, from the evidence that they collected there, it wasn't just the presence of leaves. It wasn't just the green color. But they did find that there was significantly more hesitance regarding those objects, both, I think, all of the novel objects in that category, the novel artifacts, than like the familiar artifacts or the shells in that case, right? So it was significantly less than the actual plants, but it was significantly more than those other categories. So I think it's possible, right? She's doing more research on this to sort of sketch out what those features look like, right? Maybe it's that if you have at least 3 of these features that are associated with plants, then that triggers a threshold where there's going to be aversion or something like that. And I think that evidence could be consistent with that interpretation, right? So they're avoiding it a little bit, but they're seeing like, oh no, that's clearly not a plant, and then they touch it, right? So
yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how the next few studies go with that.
Agreed. Yeah.
Our next question is again from Igor. And they ask, how do you think evolutionary psychology can escape its bad reputation?
I really think that we need to get a little bit more control over the public conversation around this, because I think that it's being largely guided by individuals right now who are, most of them are outside the area, right? Like I mentioned Jordan Peterson. I'm not trying to spend all of this time focusing on him. He's not the only voice out there. But he's not in this area, right? He clearly has interest in it, but he's not trained in this area. And so I see a lot of people in the public sphere that are sort of shaping the conversation by talking in public in this evolutionary language. And it's giving people the impression that this is what evolutionary psychology is. And so I think that more people who are sort of central to the area talking in public about these ideas hopefully will help. It's one of the reasons that I chose this topic to talk on, right? I think there needs to be more of this out there happening.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting way of looking at human behavior. And kind of once you get into the habit of it, things suddenly just look a little weird and a bit more interesting.
Yeah.
But like with a lot of science, there's so much nuance and so much detail that it's hard to boil that down to like a catchy sound bite or a nice little headline.
That's true.
And I think scientists hedge their bets. Like they're quite cautious by nature. Yeah. And that doesn't really make for a particularly like charismatic leader. You want somebody saying, I know it's this is definitely the way.
Right.
Whereas actually the smarter people were going, I'm not sure. This is what I think. Maybe, I don't know. Could be wrong. I could be wrong.
Yeah. right?
Which
So maybe,
doesn't inspire confidence.
No, it doesn't. But then again, I mean, I think that kind of conversation works really well in longer form conversations. So, this kind of platform, I think podcasting is a really good example of that. Yeah, I don't know. It can be a nice place to sort of bring forward what we know, but contextualize it appropriately the way that you're talking about. So, I don't know. Maybe that helps. Does podcasting save the world?
I hope so.
Yeah.
It'd be a really easy way to save the world. Like, save the world in your pajamas. Like, great, nice one. I'm down for that.
Yeah, speak for yourself, man. This stuff is hard. The PJs help, though. It's true. Yeah.
Our next question comes from Gray the Earthling, and they ask, supposing modern medicine affects evolution by preventing death, could that lead to long-term changes in how humans and domesticated animals behave?
So if we extend the lifespan, will that have consequences? Yeah, actually. I'm having to reach back into my conversations here, my knowledge about this stuff. But like, I remember there being something that came up when I took a seminar on evolutionary psychology in grad school. And the professor was talking about the fact that, like, if we really want to extend, like, the fertile window of reproduction, we could absolutely do this by just doing some, like, artificial selection things to extend the human lifespan, right? Essentially by, like, killing. It's terrible. So don't do this at home, right? But he was essentially saying, or maybe the point was about extending the lifespan itself. So he was saying, if you that's what it was. He was saying you could extend the human lifespan by extending the fertile window, and you could do this by killing anyone, like, or not allowing anybody to reproduce under the age of, like, 35 or something, and then you could push that fertile window back and back and back, and it would extend the lifespan. Actually, I guess I'm reverse answering the question. This is not. This isn't exactly what was being asked, but anyway, sorry. Yeah,
I guess
lost myself now.
So there will be things that are changed. Like, evolution doesn't stop. Like, it's a continuous process. We're still evolving. Yeah. So things like access to healthcare, it probably means that, like, I probably wouldn't have made it to my age. I've needed healthcare for various reasons. But that doesn't mean that healthcare is going against natural selection. It's just a change in our environment, and we're continuing to adapt to some extent with our environment. I guess I don't know if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I hope so. So our next question is another anonymous one. And they ask, what is the evolutionary psychological explanation for judgment, as in negative judgment?
Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing that the question here is about, like, the function of like moral judgment, moral emotions. And there is some really interesting literature about this. This is not something I've been steeped in recently, so I'm not going to pretend to know more than I do, right? But so I know that, some moral emotions, some of which are self-directed and some of which are directed toward others, like feeling shame and guilt, as well as feeling anger, right, and resentment and judgment toward another person's behavior, have been centered in like the violation of like social contracts, right? We're a cooperative species, and so violations of sort of these cooperative mechanisms, right, result in these kinds of judgments, right? Essentially to sort of, because, boy, we could do an entire other talk on this, right? Cooperative systems are great, right? We can do things together cooperatively that we could never do on our own. But the vulnerability in a cooperative system is that somebody who wants to cheat that system is actually going to do a little bit better in a system of cooperators, because they get all the benefits and they don't have to pay back the cost, essentially. And so one answer to that question is that reactions like these moral emotions are helping to enforce cooperation and things related to that, right? I don't think it's the only answer, right? There's some really interesting stuff that Deborah Lieberman's been working on with disgust, and regulating group norms. So that's related, but it's not, I don't think it's exactly the same mechanism. So some really interesting area. Yeah.
Great. Our next question is another anonymous one. They ask, does kin recognition have implications for future attempts to colonize Mars?
God, probably, right? I mean,
yeah. I think that we need a lot of people.
We need a lot of people. We need a lot of houses, right? Well, I guess, you could get around. It would be easy to get around the disgust thing, though, right? Like you could just, like at least for the initial stages, you could just do all sort of artificial insemination if everybody develops sort of these like kinship resistances to sexual activity, right? Because like I don't think cognitively they would have any problem with having kids if they knew that they weren't genetically related. They just wouldn't want to have sex with each other. Yeah. So that'd be okay.
Oh, it's a reasonable stance. This messy activity.
Indeed it is. Yes. Yeah.
Our next question is from Hassan, and they ask, how often do you find yourself resisting the urge to overanalyze everyday things with the lens of evolutionary psychology?
I am an overanalyzer by nature, so often, and that would be true regardless of whether I had found evolutionary psychology. Yeah, I'm a ruminator. I do a lot of ruminating. But yeah, no, I mean, once you said this a few minutes ago, Kat, like once you immerse yourself in this perspective, it's hard to unsee it. And so I do think it sort of crops up in all these different areas, for better or for worse, right? Yeah. I enjoy it, but
I think one of my favorite areas to see it crop up again is like general popular culture. Mm-hmm. Like, I think once you understand the waist to hip ratio, can't listen to Sir Mix-a-Lot the same way ever again. Like, but I know why you like big butts. Like, I get it now.
Yeah. Or somebody, Thomas brought up recently, he was like, oh, so that explains all the moms in every Pixar movie ever made. It's like, oh, yeah, it's true. Can't unsee that either.
Yeah. Okay, we are now on to our final question. And we always save special questions to the very end.
Yeah.
And it's from Parrot Lady, and they ask, Cat? Still one question.
I tried to get the cat in here. I'm so sorry. It's like he was chilling outside on the porch, and I told him he had to come in and make a debut, but I guess he was doing his hair or something. But
cats are busy creatures. They've got a lot of catting to do.
Mm-hmm. They got a big home range that they have to maintain. I get it. Yeah, but I tried.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. That was a great Q&A. I really enjoyed that.
Me too.
Really obvious.
Yeah, thank you. It's awesome.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. Don't forget, we will be having another talk next week, and that'll be from Michael DeBarra, and he'll be talking to us about why patients sometimes want bad medicine. Ooh. And that's basically it for another week. I'd like to thank tonight's behind the scenes team, which was David Glass and Malcolm on tech, and Gerald as my backup MC, who helped me sort through the questions. In a minute, we'll be opening up the doors to our virtual pub, the Lock-In's Razor, and everyone is welcome there. There's no need to turn on your camera or announce yourself if you don't feel comfortable doing so. And there'll be a couple of breakout rooms if the main room gets a bit too loud for you. And that's it. Our next details for our next talk will be on Facebook, Twitter, and on our website. That's sitp.online. And thanks again, and see you all very soon.